blood in the Red Rock shallows told you who Cade Whitlock was before he ever spoke a word. 4 winters later, a woman on his road would change him for good, though on the morning she came walking up that road, with no wagon and no horse, neither one of them yet understood how completely. The land Cade worked lay east of Sable Ridge, Wyoming Territory, a sun-beaten stretch where the Antelope River cut through red rock the way an old wound cuts through a man who never let it heal properly. A one-room cabin with a good stove and a bad roof, a vegetable patch that fought the soil every summer and mostly won. A lean-to stable, 2 horses, a rifle kept oiled, and a reputation that did more work keeping strangers at a distance than any fence he'd ever built. Nobody in Sable Ridge used the given name Cade. Folks knew him instead as the man who shot 4 outlaws at Cutbank Crossing and never once smiled about it, the way you'd name a storm after the damage it left rather than the shape it took. His face carried the evidence plainly enough, a jaw like weathered fence post, eyes the pale gray of an overcast sky, a stillness that unsettled people who mistook quiet for something dangerous. He had ridden into the territory 9 years back, with a half-broken horse and a fully broken past, and out of that wreckage he had built something. Not much, but enough to keep a man breathing, and most days that had been sufficient. He kept his own hours out there, rising before the sun without a clock to tell him to. And he had learned over 9 winters that solitude demanded very little of a man in return for what it gave him. No one to answer to about the state of the fence line, or the amount of whiskey left in the bottle behind the flour sack. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles off, and the town itself sat far enough down the canyon road that a man could go a full week without hearing another human voice besides his own low talk to the horses. Some men would have named that a punishment. Cade had come to think of it, slowly and without ever quite deciding to, as the only arrangement he trusted any more. Cutbank Crossing itself had happened on a spring morning 4 years back, when 4 men running from a botched stage robbery near the territory line tried to ford the Antelope at the shallow crossing east of Sable Ridge and found Cade already camped there alone, minding his own business with a string of green colts he'd meant to sell in town. What exactly passed between them in the 10 minutes that followed depended entirely on who was telling it. The men had fired first, that much every honest account agreed on, and Cade had walked out of the Red Rock shallows with a graze along his ribs. He had ridden straight to the sheriff's office afterward and reported it plain, the way he reported everything, without embellishment and without apology. And the territory had spent the 4 years since deciding what to make of a man who could do a thing like that and never once bring it up again on his own. Most settled on fear, a few, quietly, settled on respect. Cade himself had never settled on anything at all. He simply carried it, the way he carried most things. He had not expected company that Tuesday in late October, when the cottonwoods along the canyon had turned the color of old gold coin, and the wind had started carrying winter's first cold breath down off the ridge. He had not expected her at all. She arrived on foot. That was the detail that stopped him mid-motion at the fence post he'd been mending, a nail still pinched between his teeth. No wagon, no horse. Just a young woman walking the last stretch of dirt road in the gray afternoon light, one hand clutching a wool shawl around her shoulders as though it were the only thing left holding her together, the other pressed flat against something folded and held tight to her chest. Her name was Della Voss, and she was the daughter of Silas Voss, a man who had once pulled Cade half dead out of a raider's ambush in Widow Creek Canyon 10 years back and wanted nothing in return. Silas had been many things over the years, a trapper, a lay preacher, when the circuit man couldn't make it through the passes, non-official peacekeeper, when Sable Ridge had no real law of its own, but above everything else, he had been the rare kind of man this territory needed badly and produced rarely. He had died 4 weeks before that October afternoon. A fever had taken him in 5 days flat, the way fevers sometimes do when a body has spent itself on other people for too many years running. Cade had stood at the graveside in silence because words had never come easily to him, and grief hadn't made an exception for that particular Tuesday. He remembered standing there with his hat in both hands, thinking that the territory had just lost the only man in it who had ever bothered to ask how Cade was managing, and truly wait for the answer. Now Silas Voss's only daughter was standing on his porch with worn-through boots and a look that had run clean out of tears and replaced them with something harder. She had walked the better part of 6 miles that day, though Cade didn't yet know it, 6 miles down from the boarding house in town, past the Larkin place and the burned-out chapel foundation and the long stretch of nothing where the road forgot to be a road at all and turned to a rutted track through sage. She had promised herself the entire way that she would turn back at the halfway marker if her courage failed her. She had not turned back. She was perhaps 22. Brown hair pinned back with no particular vanity to it, eyes red-rimmed from crying, though dry in that moment, the way a well runs dry after it's given everything it has. Her boots had worn through at the left sole. She held the folded paper against her chest like something a person carries into a fight, not because it will stop a blow, but because letting go of it feels worse than getting hit. Cade stepped out from where he'd been working the fence line, stopped 10 feet from her, and didn't say her name, not because he'd forgotten it, but because he wasn't certain she'd remember him from her father's funeral, one still, silent man among a dozen others. He only looked at her and waited, the particular kind of waiting a man does when he senses something important is coming and knows better than to rush it. She looked at him a long moment, opened her mouth, closed it again, swallowed, then lowered her eyes to the porch boards, her voice barely carrying over the wind, moving through the aspens. "My father said you needed a wife." Cade let the silence stretch a moment first. The wind pushed through the dry grass at the edge of the yard. He let it sit a beat longer than most men would have dared. Then, steady and plain as canyon stone, "Maybe you." Her head came up fast enough that she nearly lost the shawl off her shoulders entirely. Her eyes went wide with something caught between confusion and a hope she plainly hadn't allowed herself to feel in weeks. She had come prepared for refusal, prepared for pity, or worse, for something like charity dressed up as kindness. She had not prepared for 2 words spoken like a quiet promise instead of a door closing. If a story like this one is keeping you company today, consider becoming a channel member. Tap Join beside the channel name. It costs you nothing extra, and it keeps stories like Cade and Della's coming every single week. She shook her head fast, pressing the folded paper harder to her chest as though she could push the whole conversation back inside it. "You don't understand. I don't have anything left. Father's debts took the house outright. I owe 2 months' rent at the Millhaven boarding house in town, and Mrs. Sallow says she'll have my trunk sitting in the street by Saturday if I don't pay or leave first." She paused, and when she lifted her eyes to him again, There was a fierceness in them that reminded Cade sharply, almost painfully, of her father. "I'm not here asking for charity." She held out the folded paper. "Your father wrote this before he died." Cade crossed the porch in 3 strides and took it from her hand. The writing was unmistakably Silas's, cramped, deliberate, the same hand from a dozen field notes and land surveys Cade had watched him scratch out over the years by lamplight. It read, "Cade, my Della is too proud to ask for help and too good to need it. But circumstance has made liars out of better people than her. I've told her to go to you. I know what I'm asking. I know what you are. Look after her. That's all I ask. S. Voss." Cade folded the letter with care and looked out at the canyon ridge a moment, where a hawk turned slow, lazy circles in the cold, high air, not looking at her directly. "Your father carried me 10 miles through Widow Creek Canyon with a bullet still lodged in my shoulder because I couldn't sit a horse on my own. Did it in the rain, in the dark, and never once complained about the weight of me. Sat with me 2 nights after while the fever tried to finish what the ambush started. Never asked for a thing in return." Della's lips pressed together. "He never told me that. He wouldn't have." Cade looked at her then, properly, for the first time. "How long before the boarding house put you out?" 5 days. "Any family left in the territory?" She shook her head, and something in the set of her shoulders confirmed it for him. No family, no wagon, no other door left to knock on. She would confess later that first evening that she had spent most of the walk down bracing herself to sleep in the church shed if the answer at his door was no. She had not shared that part with him yet. She only stood there in the cold and let the silence answer for her instead. Then come inside. Her chin came up immediately, a flare of the same pride that had carried her up the whole length of that dirt road. "I told you I'm not asking for." He held her gaze quiet but certain. "I know what you're asking for, and I know what I'm offering. Come inside, Miss Boss. Wind's picking up." They sat on opposite sides of a rough plank table, with a pot of coffee steaming between them. The cabin was bare in the honest way of a man's cabin. A cot, a cast-iron stove, 1 shelf of books, 2 oil lamps, burning low against the coming dark. Della sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap and studied everything in the room except him, the split-log walls, the single window with its coat of dust, the neat row of tools hung along one beam. Cade poured coffee into a tin cup and set it in front of her, then waited without pushing. Eventually she picked it up and held it with both hands, as though surprised to find something warm in a day that had given her so little of it. Plain as he did most things, he laid it out. "I'm not offering charity if that's the worry sitting behind your eyes. This land is more than one man can work clean through a Wyoming winter. The garden's failing from want of attention. I can't keep straight accounts, tend the horses, and mend what's breaking, all 3 at once, and pretend I'm doing any of it well." He paused. "Your father told me once your mother ran a household the way a general runs a campaign. Said you learned it from her." Della looked up plainly surprised. "He said that?" "Said you could bake bread in a dust storm and out-negotiate a merchant like a circuit judge." Something crossed her face. Not quite a smile, but close enough kin to one that it startled her a little. It passed as quickly as it came. "What exactly are you proposing?" Cade set both hands flat on the table. "A legal arrangement. Civil ceremony, nothing more than that, unless we both decide otherwise somewhere down the road. You'd have your own space here, your own standing, the legal right to stay on this property, regardless of what happens to me. In return, you help run the house and the accounts." She was quiet a long moment, watching the steam curl off the coffee. People will talk. People always talk. Doesn't change the weather, and it doesn't change the harvest. He looked at her directly. "You don't know me. I know your father. That's enough for me." What he didn't say, because it wasn't the kind of thing he shared out loud with anyone, was that the cabin had felt different since Silas Voss died. Quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound. For 9 years the old man had been the one person who rode out to the place without an errand attached to the visit, who sat on the porch step of an evening and talked about nothing much of anything simply because talking to another living soul kept a man human. Cade had not realized how much he'd come to depend on those visits until they stopped, and he had spent the 3 weeks since the funeral discovering just how loud an empty cabin could be. He only watched her turn the tin cup slowly between her hands and thought, plainly and without any particular ceremony, that Silas Voss had understood something about both of them that neither one of them had been willing to admit to themselves. She stared down at the scarred plank table outside. The wind leaned against the shutters. The oil lamp threw warm, unsteady light across her face while she thought it through, and Cade let her take her time with it, watching the play of the lamp across the fine lines of worry at her eyes without saying another word to hurry her along. At last, she drew a long breath. "When, Saturday, the circuit judge comes through Sable Ridge every second Saturday of the month, simple as signing a land deed." Della looked at him one more time, at his still face, his careful eyes, the way he sat without fidgeting, like a man who had learned patience the hard way out of necessity rather than temperament. She gave him a single, slow nod. News of it reached town well before Della's own trunk did. Sable Ridge was small enough, and starved enough for anything resembling gossip through a long autumn that by Thursday evening half the mercantile counter was talking about the Whitlock place and the Voss girl in the same low, curious breath. Some judged it charity, dressed up sensible. Others, mostly the older women who remembered Silas Voss fondly from his circuit preaching days, named it exactly what it looked like on paper, and left the rest unsaid. Sallow at the boarding house assured anyone who'd listen that she'd never once doubted the girl would land on her feet, though she doubted it plenty in private not 4 days earlier. Nobody voiced much of it to Cade's face. Nobody ever had. Saturday came in cold. A thin skim of ice had formed overnight across the water trough, and the cottonwoods had shed the last of their gold to an overnight wind that smelled like the first real edge of winter. Cade woke before dawn, which wasn't unusual for him. What was unusual was that he shaved, properly, carefully, for the first time in longer than he cared to count. He found a clean shirt folded in the trunk at the foot of his cot, dark wool, a shirt he'd kept for Sundays he no longer bothered observing, and pulled it on. He studied his reflection in the flat of his hunting knife, the closest thing the cabin owned to a mirror, and saw exactly what he expected to see, a man who'd lived hard and mostly outdoors for the better part of his life. There wasn't much to be done about that on short notice. When he came out of the cabin, Della was already standing by the fence. She wore a dress the color of faded harvest gold, modest at the collar with small mother-of-pearl buttons catching what morning light there was. It had plainly been pressed the night before, every fold set with care. She'd done her hair differently, too, pinned at the sides and left loose behind, and she stood very straight in the cold with her hands at her sides. She looked nothing at all like the woman who had arrived 4 days earlier with worn-through boots and despair sitting heavy on her shoulders. Cade stopped where he stood. "You look well." Della glanced down at the dress. "It was my mother's, the only fine thing I brought with me. It's enough." He meant it. They drove into Sable Ridge in his wagon, the town already stirring, freighters unloading crates outside the mercantile, a blacksmith's hammer ringing steady, 2 boys chasing each other down the boardwalk with a hoop and a stick. Heads turned as the wagon rolled past, and more than one conversation stopped midward, though neither Cade nor Della gave any sign of noticing. The circuit judge, a broad-weathered man named Wexford Calloway, received them in the back room of the land office with the unbothered air of a man who had officiated perhaps 60 such arrangements and found every one of them equally routine. One witness stood by, a trapper named Amos Teague, waiting on his own land deed, who agreed to sign for 2 bits and a cup of coffee without asking a single question. The ceremony lasted 7 minutes. When Judge Calloway pronounced the matter settled, Della looked at Cade, and Cade looked at Della. Neither one moved for a beat. Then he held out his arm. She took it. They walked back out into the cold Sable Ridge morning as husband and wife, and it was, without question, the quietest and most ordinary and most significant thing Cade Whitlock had done. The first weeks were a careful negotiation of space and habit, the way any new arrangement is before it settles into something more familiar. Cade rose before dawn and worked the land until dark. Della organized the cabin with a focus that bordered on military precision, finding a system for the accounts that took Cade 3 full days to understand and, once he did, made him wonder how he'd ever managed without it. She fixed the chicken wire on the coop herself, negotiated a better rate on winter wheat down at the Sable Ridge Mercantile, and produced full meals out of a half-bare pantry. She scrubbed the cabin windows until the low afternoon light finally came through, clean instead of gray, and she hung her mother's one good tablecloth over the plank table on Sundays, a small, defiant square of lace in a room that had never known one. Cade noticed these things without remarking on most of them, the way a man notices weather changing before he's willing to admit the season has actually turned. They were careful with each other in the way 2 people are careful when they both understand how easily a fragile arrangement can be broken, and neither wants to be the one holding the blame for it. Della kept mostly to her side of the cabin. Cade kept to his. They talked at supper, practical things, weather and livestock and supply lists. But slowly, without either one deciding to allow it exactly, the conversation began to stretch longer than it needed to. She shared with him her childhood in the Nebraska Territory, following her father from one small settlement to the next as he worked one trade and then another, never quite staying anywhere long enough to plant real roots. She described a winter in a soddy so cold the ink froze in the well before her father could finish a letter, and the year he'd traded his only good coat for a stranger's medicine. In the sparse way he shared most things, he described for her coming up from Missouri with $55 to his name and a horse that dropped dead 3 days after he'd crossed into the territory, and the stubborn conviction he'd carried ever since that this land owed him nothing at all, and he owed it everything. She studied him one evening, not quite asking a question. You don't ask for much, do you? Asking invites disappointment. Della looked at him across the table in the lamplight. My father used to say, that men who expect nothing from the world are usually the ones who deserve the most from it. Cade considered that a long, even moment. He lifted his coffee. "Your father was right about most things." Della laughed, quiet, brief. She seemed surprised by the sound of it herself. But it changed something in the room's air all the same. After that evening, the silences between them felt different somehow. Less like distance, more like the particular quiet two people share once they've stopped being strangers to one another. Cade found himself, without quite meaning to, listening for the particular sound of her moving around the cabin in the mornings, the scrape of the stove door, the low hum she didn't seem to know she made while kneading bread, and finding that he missed it on the rare morning. There was an evening in early December, the ground frozen hard enough to ring under a boot heel, when Della pressed him outright on why he'd never married before her, and Cade sat with the question a long while before taking it up. He shared with her the story of a girl back in Missouri before the war, and everything after it had hollowed him out some, and how he'd been too young and too proud to say the right thing to her at the right time, and how she'd married a storekeeper instead, and Cade had ridden west not long after. It wasn't a long story, and he didn't recount it like a wound still open, only like a fact a man carries the way he carries the color of his own eyes. Della listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she didn't offer him pity, which he was grateful for, more than she likely understood. She only refilled his cup, observing that folks who ran from things usually ran toward something else without knowing it yet, and Cade turned that thought over for the better part of a week afterward. The way a man turns over a stone he suspects is heavier than it looks. It was a woman named Loretta Vance who decided to make things difficult. Loretta was the widow of Franklin Vance, who had built the largest cattle operation north of the Antelope River, before a fall from a green horse ended him 4 years back, leaving her sole owner of 11,000 acres. Since his death, Loretta had run the ranch herself with an iron precision that most men in the territory grudgingly admired and privately feared. In roughly equal measure, she outbid 3 separate buyers on contested grazing rights the year after Franklin died, and folks had learned quickly that underestimating her was an expensive habit to keep. She had also, for the better part of 2 years, tried more than once to buy the wedge of Cade's land that sat against her northern pasture and controlled the only reliable creek access for miles in any direction. He had turned her down every single time, politely at first, and then simply by not answering her letters at all. She had not forgotten a single refusal. Loretta arrived at the cabin on a gray November morning, driving a black lacquered buggy that looked entirely out of place on the rutted canyon road. She was perhaps 50, dressed in dark wool and silver jewelry, with the composed expression of a woman who had spent years winning arguments and rarely lost the habit of it. Della opened the door. Loretta looked her over with a slow, deliberate appraisal from her plain dress down to her worn boots. Her voice came sweet as sugar. "You must be the new arrangement." Della gave no answer. She only opened the door wider. Cade came in from outside. When he saw Loretta standing on his porch, he stopped, and his expression didn't change at all, which was in its own way a kind of answer, Mrs. Vance. "I'd heard you'd taken a wife under rather peculiar circumstances." Circumstances were straightforward enough. Loretta smiled. "I'm sure they were. A destitute girl and a lonely man." "Tell me, dear, did he happen to mention this property sits under a disputed water claim? that the Territorial Cattle Association holds the legal right to reroute the creek that feeds this whole stretch of land. It was a lie, and Cade knew it plainly, and Loretta knew that he knew it. But it was the particular kind of lie that costs money and lawyers to disprove, and she was counting on the two of them having neither. "I'll take that up with the association myself," Cade said flatly. "Or," Loretta said, pleasant as ever, "you could simply sell to me fair market price. You and your bride could start fresh somewhere without any of these complications." Della stepped forward then. Her voice came quiet and level. "Thank you for the visit, Mrs. Vance. The road back to town is a good deal easier before dark sets in." Loretta regarded her with fresh interest, then smiled the particular smile that means the opposite of warmth, and stepped down off the porch. She paused beside the buggy. "That girl has a spine," she said, addressing Cade directly, as though Della weren't standing 3 feet away. "Pity it won't be near enough." Then she drove off, and the canyon road swallowed the sound of her wheels. Della stood watching the dust settle a long while after the buggy had rounded the bend, her arms crossed tight against the cold. Loretta Vance had not always been the kind of woman who threatened a stranger's wife on a cold porch. Folks who remembered her from before Franklin's accident spoke of a different woman, entirely, sharp, yes, but generous with it, the kind who'd once driven 15 miles through a hailstorm to sit with a dying ranch hand's widow. Something in her had hardened past recognition. In the 4 years since the funeral, the way grief sometimes calcifies into something meaner than it started as, until the only language she seemed to have left for wanting a thing was threatening whoever stood between her and it. Cade had heard both versions of Loretta Vance over the years, and had never much cared which one was closer to true. All that mattered to him was the woman standing in his yard now, and she had made her intentions plain enough without needing a history lesson to explain them. "She'll try something," Della said finally. "Probably," Cade agreed. "You don't sound worried. I've dealt with worse than a rich widow with a grudge." He looked at her, and something in his face softened just slightly at the edges. "You held your own out there. Didn't flinch once." "I've had practice not flinching," Della said, and went back inside before he could ask what she meant by it. The trouble came 3 weeks later, in the hard frost of November's tail end. Cade woke to the smell of smoke before he heard a single thing, that particular chemical sharpness that isn't wood smoke rising off a stove, but something larger, something being consumed that had no business burning. He was outside. In under a minute, the hay barn was already alight, flames working up the east wall toward the roofline with the lazy confidence of something that already knew it was going to win. He shouted once toward the cabin and ran for the water pump. Della came out behind him with a blanket and a bucket before he'd even finished the shout, her hair loose and wild in the wind, her bare feet shoved hastily into unlaced boots. They fought it for the better part of an hour in the freezing dark, Cade at the pump and Della hauling bucket after bucket, both of them coughing in air gone thick and bitter with smoke. The heat of the fire fighting the bitter cold at their backs in a way that left neither of them sure which one they were more desperate to escape. At one point, a burning rafter cracked loose and came down not 4 feet from where Della stood, and Cade hauled her back by the arm hard enough to bruise. Both of them too winded and too frightened to speak of it after. They saved the structure, barely. The east wall was a total loss. Most of the hay inside had burned down to ash. The 2 horses had been out in the pasture that night. which was the one piece of luck in the whole business. When it was finally over, they stood together in the snow and looked at what remained. Della's face was streaked black with ash, her hands raw and red from the freezing water. She was shaking, not from the cold, Cade understood, but from the particular exhaustion that follows a sustained and desperate effort. He found her coat where she'd dropped it, running out of the cabin, and set it around her shoulders. She didn't thank him right away. She stood staring at the ruined wall with an expression that had moved past upset into something colder, something far more purposeful. Inside, once the worst of the smoke had cleared and the horses were settled, Cade wrapped her raw hands in strips of clean cloth soaked in cold well water, working slow and careful over each knuckle while she sat silent at the table, staring at nothing. Neither of them said much for a long while. The stove ticked as it warmed the room back up, and somewhere outside a horse, stamped once in the dark, unsettled still by the smell of smoke that clung to everything. "You didn't have to come out there," Cade said eventually, still bent over her hands. "Could have stayed inside where it was safe." Della looked at him like the suggestion itself was the strange part. "It's my land too now." "My barn burning same as yours." She flexed her bandaged fingers carefully and winced. "Besides, two people fighting a fire beats one every time. My father taught me that much, even if he never got around to teaching me how to actually swing a bucket without half of it landing on my own boots." Something in Cade's chest loosened at that, a small unfamiliar ease he didn't have a ready name for. He finished, tying off the last strip of cloth, and didn't let go of her hand right away, and she didn't pull it back either, and for a long moment the two of them simply sat there in the low stove light, worn through and smoke-stained and entirely unwilling to be anywhere else. She did this, it wasn't a question. Cade said nothing for a moment. "I'll ride into Sable Ridge at first light." "And say what? We've got no proof." "We'll find proof." He looked at the scorched beam nearest the base of the wall, not near the stove connection, not near the lamp line, but low along the outside where the snow still carried the unmistakable mineral stink of coal oil. Della followed his gaze and understood at once. "Who would she have sent?" she asked. "There's a man named Jesse Cobb who runs errands for the Vance operation. He's been in front of the sheriff twice already." Cade said it quietly, already 3 moves ahead in his own head, the particular way a man thinks once he's been pushed clean past patience and into a plan. Della pulled the coat tighter around herself. She looked at him with an expression he hadn't quite seen on her before. Not gratitude, exactly, not dependence, but something a good deal closer to partnership. "I'll ride with you," she said, "first light." Sheriff Walton Deakins was a methodical man. He didn't move fast, but he moved sure, and once Cade laid out what they had, the coal oil pattern in the snow, the direction of the boot tracks, a canteen with a plain letter V stamped into its side, found some 25 yards off from the barn, Deakins listened without a single interruption, then pulled on his coat without a word wasted. Jesse Cobb was found at the Silver Anchor Saloon on Front Street at 9 that morning, which told its own story well enough. He was not a man who held up well under pressure, and Deakins was thorough about applying it, sitting across from him in the sheriff's small back office for the better part of 2 hours while the rest of Sable Ridge went about its ordinary Tuesday business, entirely unaware of the confession slowly taking shape 3 doors down. By noon, Cobb had given a full statement. Loretta Vance had paid him $60 to torch the hay barn, and leave behind exactly enough damage to convince Cade that staying on the land was more trouble than it was worth. It took 2 days for the news to travel the length of Sable Ridge, but in a winter town of fewer than 300 souls, 2 days was more than plenty. Some folks were surprised. Most, Cade suspected. Loretta had made enemies across the territory with the same efficiency she applied to everything else in her life. The Territorial Cattle Association, reading which way the wind was turning, quietly withdrew its backing of her water claim, which had, exactly as Cade suspected, been invented from the start. Neighbors who had never once stopped their wagons at the Whitlock place began stopping anyway. Leaving a sack of feed, corn, or a jar of preserves on the porch without knocking, the particular kind of quiet apology a small town offers when it realizes it misjudged a man for longer than it should have. Della had gone to the land office herself the very morning after the sheriff's visit and requested a full copy of every recorded deed in water, right tied to their property. She spread the papers across the supper table that evening with the same methodical calm of someone conducting an inquest, found 2 clear discrepancies in Loretta's claimed boundary line, and wrote them up in a letter to the Territorial Land Commissioner in a hand so precise and so well argued that Cade read it through twice, just to be certain he hadn't imagined the quality of it. The commissioner's reply came back within the month, brief and final, confirming the creek access had always belonged to the Whitlock land outright and had never once been in genuine dispute. "Where did you learn to write like that?" he asked her. "My father made me copy legal documents for practice starting when I was 12, she said. He always said a woman who could read a contract properly was a good deal harder to cheat than one who couldn't. Cade looked at her a long moment. He thought of Silas Voss carrying him 10 miles through the rain with a bullet still in his shoulder. He thought about the particular kind of man who raises a daughter like this one. "He was right about nearly everything, wasn't he?" he said quietly. "If Della and Cade's story has found you at just the right moment, become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name. Members get to walk with us through every one of these frontier stories, week after week." Della looked up from the papers. Something moved across her face. Grief first, and then something warmer than grief. "Almost," she said, a pause. "He said you needed a wife. I think he was only half right about what you actually needed." Spring came late to the Antelope Canyon that year, but when it finally arrived, it came all at once, the river running high and cold, the red rock warming through the long afternoons, the garden Della had planned out across the long January evenings, finally breaking ground with the first green shoots pushing up through the Wyoming soil. Loretta Vance sold her ranch that March and left the territory without a single farewell arranged in her name. Nobody in Sable Ridge organized one either. Rebuilding the barn became, in its own quiet way, the thing that finally settled Cade Whitlock's standing in Sable Ridge. 6 neighboring men showed up unannounced on a Saturday in April with their own tools and their own lumber wagons, men who had spent 9 years crossing the road rather than stopping at his gate. And by sundown the new east wall stood framed and square, and somebody's wife had set up a table of food along the fence line without being asked. Cade worked alongside them all day, mostly in silence, the way he worked at everything, but Della watched something in his shoulders ease that she hadn't seen loosen since the day she'd first walked up his road. Della painted the finished wall without being asked, using a red ochre wash that made it look, she said, like it had always been that color. He didn't argue the point. It did look better. What changed between them didn't happen in any one moment a person could point to later. It happened the way a season changes, gradually, and then, all at once, unmistakably. He noticed it first on a morning in late February, when Della carried coffee out to where he was working the fence line, and the two of them stood together in the cold, watching the sun climb over the canyon ridge. He hadn't shared a silence like that with another living soul in 9 years. He noticed it again the night she read to him from one of his books, a passage about the nature of loyalty, and stopped partway through to look at him and ask whether he believed loyalty was a choice a person made, or simply a feeling that arrived on its own. They talked 2 full hours after that, the lamp burning low, the stove ticking as it cooled, neither one paying the slightest attention to the hour. He noticed it a third time on an ordinary Sunday when Della hung a small framed sketch of her mother above the mantel, the first thing either of them had hung on those walls in 9 years that wasn't strictly useful, and he found he liked coming in from the cold to see it there. He didn't tell her he loved her with any kind of speech. He told her on a Tuesday in March while they were mending a fence post together out in the cold spring mud, plain as he said most things, without theater and without apology. Della set down the hammer and looked at him a long moment. "I know," she said, then, correcting herself softer, "I love you too, Cade. I think I have for a while now." "I wasn't certain you'd want to hear it," he said. "I want to hear it every day." She smiled, then the full kind, the kind that reached her eyes and stayed there. "Then you will." Before we ride toward the end of Cade and Della's story, tap join beside the channel name to become a channel member and help keep these frontier tales coming. That summer, Silas Voss's daughter and the man he'd sent her to were the most talked about couple in Sable Ridge, not for scandal, but for the garden that fed half the neighboring families clean through a dry August, for the barn dances Della organized on the first Saturday of every month. Dot fiddle and lantern lights spilling out across the yard until the small hours, and for the way the man with the canyon gray eyes had stopped being someone people carefully stepped around, and started being someone. Children who once crossed to the far side of the street at the sight of him now ran up to ask if the stories about Cut Bank Crossing were true, and he'd give them some quiet, careful version of an answer and send them home before dark, and Della would watch him from the porch with an expression she never fully explained to him. The first of those barn dances nearly didn't happen at all. Della had proposed the idea. In May, half certain, nobody in Sable Ridge would drive out to a place still known for its silent, feared owner, and Cade had gone along with it, mostly because refusing her anything by then had become a habit he no longer bothered fighting. He'd spent 2 days rebuilding the loft floor, sound enough to hold dancing feet, grumbling the whole while that nobody would come, and then had stood at the edge of his own rebuilt barn. Quiet, astonishment as 3 wagon loads of neighbors rolled up the canyon road, with fiddles and pied tins and children already running ahead of their parents toward the lantern light. Amos Teague, the same trapper who'd signed as witness to their wedding, played fiddle badly and enthusiastically until well past midnight, and Cade danced exactly once, clumsy and stiff and entirely unpracticed, with his wife laughing quietly against his shoulder the whole way through it, and he decided, standing there in his own rebuilt barn full of neighbors' voices, that he could learn to live with being watched so long as it was this particular kind of watching. Years later, when Della was gray at the temples and Cade's canyon gray eyes had gone a shade paler still, the two of them would sit some evenings on that same porch and watch grandchildren chase each other across the yard where a young woman had once stood clutching a wool shawl and a folded letter. and neither of them would need to say much about how far the road had carried them from that cold October afternoon. Cade Whitlock had ridden into Wyoming territory 9 years before Della ever walked up his road with nothing but stubbornness and a half-broken horse. He hadn't expected softness, or partnership, or the particular kind of peace that comes from loving someone who chooses every single morning to stay. He hadn't expected, either, that a feared man's name might one day be spoken kindly in the same town that once crossed the street to avoid it, or that the quiet at the edge of his own porch could someday. But Silas Voss had known. The old man had known it all along, long before either of the two people he'd set on this road toward each other had any notion of it themselves. That was the thing about genuine goodness. It sees what's possible between two people long before the people themselves have any idea, and it is willing, even from the far side of the grave, to send them walking toward it anyway.